I should. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm Henry Hale, professor of political science and international affairs here at the Elliott School and the Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies. I'm also the director of the Petrov program on Ukraine here at the Institute, which has been supporting Ukrainian scholars and scholarship and research on Ukraine since the early 1990s. And so in that regard, we're extremely pleased. It's a great personal pleasure as well for me to introduce our colleague Volodymyr Zubovik, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs in the Department of International Relations and Director for the Center of International Studies at Odessa Mechnikov National University in Ukraine. There's much more that I can say about him. He's a longtime member of Ponar's Eurasia, has contributed really valuable insights over the course of many years, and I've learned personally a great deal from him. But I think let's just get straight to him, and he'll be giving a talk on a year of living dangerously, dynamics of Ukraine-U.S. wartime relations, obviously an extremely important topic during these dire times.
Right. So, thank you so much, Henry. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a thanks to everyone who put this talk together. And thank you, of course, to all of you for coming to listen to that talk. I think it's really important, but it gives me a very special pleasure to be here today because, as you mentioned, I've had this association with Ponar's Eurasia project for a number of years, actually since 2002. Right now, Ponar's is undergoing some evolution and rotating some of the personnel and cadres, but I hope to be able to be with Ponar's in the coming years. And also, I think I should mention that I am a non-resident fellow with GW, receiving that kind of fellowship some time ago. Well, basically, I think late summer last year. So since September of last year. And one last thing maybe is that if you really want to know, the best kind of quality analysis on the war and what's happening, where it's going, you should actually definitely try and get the latest book by Henry and Algonov as well. So they wrote a book and you need to take a look. I mean, it's really very serious scholarship right there, because of course out there, you can find all sorts of takes, and some of them are not very, of not a very good quality, but so here you need to know. So also, most finally, maybe I should tell you that within the Ponar's Eurasia, there is some effort of a bunch of us designed, directed at, aimed at creating a task force on Ukraine as well. So a bunch of Ponar's Eurasia members are interested in providing some kind of a collective group teamwork effort in terms of analyzing everything dealing with Ukraine. And one of the important subjects for Ukraine, obviously, going forward now is US-Ukraine relations, or should I say Ukraine-US relations, but I keep saying US-Ukraine all the time because US is always stronger, US is always like leading that relationship, is really capturing initiative often. But these days, actually, not maybe necessarily that much, because Ukraine is also having a lot of agency these days. So actually, Ukraine is a very vibrant, active partner in this bilateral cooperation. But of course, if you look at the resources and everything, the role that the US play internationally, the role that the US can play to help Ukraine in this war, then it's enormous. It's enormous. So that being said, I mean, of course, there are many success stories between the two countries for the last almost a year, because soon we're going to be commemorating or just recognizing this first anniversary of this massive invasion. But there've been also some problems here and there before and during this year, and there might be some frictions in the coming months, years. We need to remind everyone that the relations have the status of strategic partnership. Formally, actually, ever since late 90s, like mid 90s, late 1990s. A lot of times, strategic partnership wasn't really filled up with a proper cooperation and extensive interaction of two countries, but it was there, and actually shortly before the invasion, when Zelensky came here first time before the war for his state visit, or was it actually not state visit, but official visit to Washington, D.C. in the end of August, summer of 2021, that strategic partnership was kind of revived, reaffirmed, and very much so. And there were statements that the countries are going to do more to actually, put on the agenda, put on the table more of something that might have be characteristic of strategic partnership. And then soon thereafter, of course, there was this major test of what America is thinking maybe about being a strategic partner, because of course you had this massive congregation of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders, and they were very tense several months prior to February 24th last year, when US was basically working under assumption that Russia is getting ready for massive invasion. Ukraine was not. And that's one element we need to remember, how it all started. It wasn't necessarily very successful or happy preparation or cooperation in the months coming up to February 24th, 2022, because many of those American warnings to Ukraine that, well, we believe that Russia is getting ready for this massive invasion, we're not meeting adequate response and understanding and proper action by Ukrainian leadership. And there are many various reasons for that. First of all, the US haven't necessarily shared all of its intelligence with Ukraine. We now know it, not to reveal some of the sources and everything. So maybe some of the most compelling evidence proving that Russia is actually on the eve of invading was shown to Ukraine like days before February 24th. So it was already kind of probably maybe too late to do too much in those remaining days. Other thing is that even though they are close allies in Europe, Americans were not sharing much of their intelligence, and therefore most of the message we were having in Ukraine coming from European allies was like Americans exaggerating. They're too alarmist. Well, probably you're gonna see another type of intimidation, blackmail by Russia massing those troops on your borders. You've been there before. That was another argument that Ukraine was often mentioning, like we've seen those congregations before, including in the spring of 2021. So yeah, why should we react differently this time around? And that particular congregation back in the spring 21 didn't result in invasion. So why this one should result in invasion would be stupid, it would be a completely irrational, strange, bizarre decision for Putin to actually greenlight that invasion. So that was a dominating point of view in Ukraine among the political elites, definitely among the experts. I took part in countless roundtables and panels in the months and weeks coming to February 24th last year, and I wasn't sure myself. What do you make of it? Is it really a massive intimidation campaign, or is it preparation for invasion? Both options were on the table for us to consider, and no one truly knew. I definitely didn't, being an expert in the provincial Ukrainian university, I didn't have any privy, any access to some information that would allow me to say confidently, like, okay, yeah, it's a preparation for this imminent massive invasion. You may remember even like bickering about the word imminent. At some point of time, Ukrainians were really protesting how US is using this word imminent, and this administration decided not to use word imminent anymore. And on other things, like for instance, President Biden saying that our reaction will depend on what we see on Russia's behalf. What would Russia do? If it's minor incursion, he said, we would do certain things. If it's bigger invasion, other things. There've been rumors that there've been as much as 38 different scenarios prepared within this administration, depending on what exactly Russia does, where it goes, what kind of tools it uses. Is it like actually hard power? Is it hybrid? Is it cyber? Is it what is it? So there were some preparations, and that was very important, and people shouldn't forget about it. I mean, because a lot of times now when we talk about Ukraine-US relations, people tend to focus on like, okay, here's February 24th, and let's see what's happening after. Actually, you have to see what was happening before, because of course you had this little bit of disconnect, unfortunate disconnect maybe between Kyiv and Washington, but also you have here in this town a lot of preparation for possible Russian invasion. The military working on scenarios, basically, outlining, sketching out those corridors, routes that they would take to bring weapons into Ukraine if Russia invades. The sanctions were prepared by this country, but also in cooperation with Europe. And I would stress this out and put an emphasis on this, how important it is for this administration to lead, to coordinate that coalition of countries that are sanctioning Russia and supporting Ukraine. I don't think without American leadership on this issue, we would have such a strong and robust and a coherent and unified response as we're seeing from a whole bunch of countries, a big number of countries. Like if you think about what in Ukraine we often call Ramstein format, but it's formally known as Ukraine Defense Contact Group meetings. it's 50 countries or more sometimes, depending on which one. We had 9 meetings already. So it's US putting them together. It's US actually talking to allies on each and every case. Before February 24th, since February 24th, in the last few weeks on tanks, look at the situation with the tanks provision, of course, without American intervention, very forceful, maybe sometimes reluctant when it comes to provision of Abrams. There wouldn't be any positive decision on giving Ukraine tanks. So so a lot of was put in place in such a way that when invasion started, it immediately kicked into force, immediately carried out this policy. So that was a big deal, because if you imagine that you only begin thinking, how do you react to what Russia does to Ukraine on February 24th, then it takes weeks at best, maybe months, before you actually put together, how do you support Ukraine? How do you sanction Russia? How do you actually physically, logistically, transport all those weapons into Ukraine? What are the routes? What are the entry points into Ukrainian territory and so on? But all of that was taken care of before, so that's important. But ever since, of course, that cooperation, however, it's really increased and picked up in speed and pace. I should mention why there is not much of a well, not much. I wouldn't say not much, but why there is a problem with trust on both sides, specifically on Ukrainian side towards what Americans are saying and doing. It goes back. It really goes back, in my view, maybe even prior to 2019, but definitely back to 2019 when President Zelensky became president, and immediately what he saw in dealing with the US was this harsh, very tough, very kind of unusual, unconventional blackmail campaign by Trump administration. So Zelensky got this episode in his mind and people around him. And I've been arguing a lot of times when I talk about this issue, and a lot of other experts tend to be like surprised that I think this is a factor. I'm pretty sure it's a factor. It's traumatized Ukraine. It's actually left a lingering trauma and lingering distrust in Kyiv, specifically in this team, around this president, towards what America does and what America says. Does America actually has Ukraine's best interest at heart, when it does something, or is it just playing some games, which are politically profitable, maybe to US geopolitically, maybe to some particular political players here in this country? So there was a big lesson, unfortunate lesson, I think, that Ukrainian leadership, current leadership, has learned because of the 2019, and then of course Ukraine being dragged through hearings, impeachment hearings, and so on. And as we also know, that the Trump presence in the political spectrum of this country remains to be a problem for Ukraine-US relations. So ever since 2016, at least, when Trump was already saying things like, I don't know why we should support Ukraine and say not Russia. Why shouldn't we recognize Crimea, for instance, as a part of Russia? And constantly for the next 4 years already in the White House, asking again and again of his advisors, like, tell me again, like, why are we supporting Ukraine? So it's like kind of interesting. And I think many presidents needed that kind of rationale being provided to them by more knowledgeable people on the subject. Quite recently, I think in one memoirs on Obama years, I couldn't remember who exactly, but it was written that Obama also had meetings like that early on in that war in 2014. And he also pressed people around him to tell him exactly what's the rationale, even like for public relations kind of explanation, like why we're supporting Ukraine. What should I actually mention? So, but Obama, of course, was more maybe knowledgeable about why US should support Ukraine. That's another thing, of course, that also, if you look through the recent history, a lot of people who are in this administration, of course, in this town, they also graduates from Obama administration. So a lot of them are guided by this notion that they probably didn't get it quite right back then in 2014 and 2015. So they probably didn't do enough for Ukraine, to support Ukraine, maybe just stopped short of doing certain things that they were supposed to be doing. So therefore, I think they're trying maybe to redeem themselves in some ways, but also still being very careful, and the distrust is still there. Zelensky sometimes believes what Americans telling him, sometimes not. Sometimes he says, well, probably we should do what Americans tell us, probably sometimes not. There is a big discussion on what the Ukrainian military should do, for instance, right now. And we know that American military has been involved very much so in planning of operations and, and providing even like very precise coordinates for Ukrainian military strikes. They were involved in planning operations in Kharkiv region and near Kherson and so on. But not right now. There's probably not exactly eye to eye in between, Pentagon and Ukrainian leadership, military and political, in terms of like what should we do? What should we do about Bakhmut? For instance, Ukrainian position, we are fighting to the last guy there. American position, well, I don't know why you're doing that. You're kind of losing tons of your guys. Bakhmut is not that important. You save more of your forces, maybe for other dimensions and directions of the front line. And actually, if you're thinking about further offensive, liberating more land, then you need to withdraw some of your guys from Bakhmut. And okay, Russia will have it. It's all right. They had a lot of those lands that now liberated by Ukrainian military later on. When you're trained on those weapons we're giving you, you'll be able to do a successful offensive. So there is some discussion there, so it's probably okay. I mean, generally, this administration has been very respectful in terms of like, okay, Ukrainians kind of know what they're doing, their country is their fate, it's their territorial integrity, is their military, they're losing their own guys, we're only providing financial assistance, massive one, yes, weapons as well, but it's ultimately Ukrainian decision. And I think it is. And also, if you think someone that probably thinking, okay, maybe how about maybe Washington deciding the future of Ukraine behind Ukraine's back, when Ukraine is not in the room, talking directly to Russia, maybe putting Ukraine's issue and Ukraine's future within the context of the broader rearrangement of relationship with Russia, not quite possible. First of all, not possible to keep it completely confidential. Definitely would be very upsetting to Ukraine, so that would be even upsetting the trust and cooperation even more so. And finally, Ukraine has agency. Ultimately, Ukraine has really, with paying a lot of, high cost for that. We have agency, what we call in Ukrainian often when we say subjectivity, subjectivность, but okay, I'll keep with English. But here it's probably better to say agency internationally. So we make decisions ourselves, okay, and then we tell our allies, this is what we want to do. Can you help us? And then our allies, including Americans, say, okay, here we can help you. Here maybe no less so. But ultimately, the decision is yours. So that's a big difference to what it was before. So it's not necessarily that bilateral relations are always now led just by Washington and Kyiv. It's just saying yes and doing what Washington wants. It's never been this case, really. Even less so in matters not related necessarily to the military affairs or security, but more related to, say, political affairs and, say, reforms and corruption. That's been always an Achilles heel, really, for Ukraine-US relations. No Ukrainian government or president ever liked US to be focusing on corruption and reforms. This president, previous president, the reaction was always like, why are you even talking about corruption? We have this war with Russia on our hands, in case you haven't noticed, just help us to fight that war. And we'll talk about corruption later when we're done with the war. And but from this town, of course, the message was always like, no, we couldn't. I mean, it would be wrong. I mean, you have to do both. You have this war on your hands. It's a low intensity for 8 years, and then now this massive war. But also, you need to continue doing reforms and fighting corruption. And by the way, the position of this town, there is a connection between those two. Because if you have a weak, corrupt, domestic base, really, you couldn't really be successful in your war effort or your international efforts. So there's always been a convincing, I think quite convincing to me personally, at least, this message, the rationale behind it, the argument behind it, but not necessarily to Ukrainian political leaders who were often annoyed, irritated, like, why is, again, we're talking about corruption and so on. The recent case about corruption, by the way, in Ukraine has been an interesting moment, of course, when it was revealed that it was a scandal, allegedly, Ministry of Defense buying some meals, procuring meals at some inflated prices. It's damaging, of course. I mean, still, there are conversations like what exactly is there is true, what is not true, what is proven, what is not proven. But there is something there, most probably, and I can believe it because my point of view is like, okay, you cannot, if you're Ukraine, you cannot do away with corruption overnight. No, even as there is this war, which actually makes it more of an even intense public pressure on the government to deal with corruption ultimately, because people say we're fighting this war for our survival. Don't we have to also take a chance and take this moment and use it to get our act together and cleanse our country, from that sin of corruption? That's a public attitude, clearly. So therefore, there was outrage within Ukraine, and Zelensky had to do something quickly about it. And there was also concern outside of Ukraine. And that's why he moved in, quickly and deposed some people, removed some people. There were some firings here and there, and there might be some more. We'll see some rotation of the cadres. At least it shows that Zelensky is apt enough, or his inner circle, or him, or them together, making that decision that we need to, we shouldn't waste time. We shouldn't be just denying or defending like it was a line, the public relation line for the Minister of Defense in the first few days since the scandal, like this didn't happen, it's not true, and so on. And immediately was clear it's not working. All right, not with Ukrainian domestic audience, not with international allies. So I think when Zelensky interfered personally, it was the right thing to do. Yeah, I mean, quickly remove some people. So I'm in control. That is a problem. We're going to address it. We're aware, and so on. Yeah, and also I think we need to understand that Ukraine being corrupt or not corrupt, it matters to some people when they think about supporting Ukraine right now during the war. It doesn't matter to others. Like some people might say, well, maybe Ukraine is a corrupt country, but still, it's a victim of this brutal aggressive aggression, so we need to support it anyway. But others would say, well, maybe this argument of Ukraine, say, retaining some corruption as a part of their political, economic, social culture is a problem for us in terms of mobilizing support for Ukraine, for this country. Like in this particular country where we are right now, United States. That's a concern. That's exactly an argument which is being used by some people who are opposing now, being critical of continuing supporting Ukraine, that Ukraine is corrupt. Trump's been saying this for years now, and people who are in his faction of the Republican Party, they are using this argument again and again. So anytime you hear such news from Ukraine, they'll be only saying, like we told you before, it's a corrupt country, we shouldn't help it. We shouldn't be assisting it. They're gonna just pocket some money and something like abuse assistance. We couldn't trust them. So why shouldn't we just direct our money, that's tens and tens of billions of dollars, elsewhere? And they're always ready to say where, like on southern border, for instance. It's a bigger problem, if you listen to some of them, to Ukraine and to U.S. national security than Ukraine fighting the war against Russia. So yeah, and another problem, since I mentioned that, of course, is that there is this attempt in this town to understand where the war is going, what Ukraine would like to achieve. And apparently there have been very intensive discussions and dialogue between Kyiv and Washington in recent months on this particular subject. We in Ukraine also try to understand what is ahead of us, because formally, of course, if you look at the rhetorics and the public attitude, rhetorics of the political leadership, public attitude there in Ukraine, it's liberating all Ukrainian lands, full stop, period. There's no alternatives, there's no other option. And if Ukrainian leadership, it's probably only natural to make such statements. I mean, how can you expect Zelensky maybe to one day come out and say something like, okay, we're going to liberate some of those, but those maybe others will let them, Russia have them. So it's not possible even to contemplate this scenario. For the public opinion, same thing. When you hear president, okay, saying we're going to liberate all our lands, when you see our military being capable of liberating some of our lands last year, several times, in several counteroffensives, it emboldens people. It creates this public attitude within the country. You look at the public opinion polls, it's always like 90+% of people supporting this idea that we should liberate all our lands. And not to mention that with public opinion policy, probably much more knowledgeable even than I am with it, but about it, Henry and others, some others in the room. But if you approach someone now in the street in Ukraine and you ask this question, like, would you like us to liberate all the lands that now currently being occupied by Russia? What kind of question, answer you expect from the person? Any reasonable person, any average kind of Ukrainian would say, sure, of course I would like it. But another question, can we do it? Can we do it? Can we still do it militarily? Can we do it logistically? Do we have enough weapons right now? Can we have enough weapons like in 2 or 3 months from now? Would that be enough? What can we actually deal with this Russian, what I now call Russia resilience? Because we've been talking for a year for a good reason about Ukraine's resilience, but we now might talk about Russia's resilience. They're doubling down, they're mobilizing people, they're changing attitudes in their economic, production and military production. They're changing the narrative. They're trying more and more. This is defensive war. It's fair. It's patriotic. It's this collective West out there to destroy us. So it's working with a lot of Russians. So can we actually fight that back? Because it's still an asymmetric conflict. Even though Ukrainian military has been able to fight back heroically and successfully in many cases, it's a massively asymmetric conflict by definition, by default. Even with weakened Russia by the first year of this war, you still have them having much more population, so therefore their reserves to mobilize even more people, are clearly there. Their natural resources, their financial resources, they're getting the money, enough of this money to fund this war indefinitely. Can we say the same thing about Ukraine? Ukraine budget is basically non-existent. We are only surviving only exclusively due to assistance coming from abroad. Can we say that assistance will be coming in such a massive numbers as we need to survive and fight this war in the coming months, in the coming years? I don't know. So therefore, I mean, of course, there should be this discussion ahead within Kiev, within Ukrainian political elite, within Ukrainian society. How far can we go? Shouldn't we anticipate some moment, some point of time when we just say, we keep losing our guys, our military is just, going through some very serious losses. Can we actually liberate our lands? And but very patiently, Washington is waiting for Ukraine to figure out, and there've been visits, lots of visits in recent months, starting from Jake Sullivan going there before Zelensky visit here to Washington before New Year, and following with many other visits later, when they're trying to see eye to eye, to basically consolidate their position on what's the end game. Because definitely here, the expert community, the political class, the public, if you look at the public opinion polls in this country, is still very supportive of Ukraine, but the trend is undeniable. It's slowly decreasing. The willingness to be there for a long haul and continue supporting Ukraine indefinitely with this massive financial assistance, might not be there at some point of time. And I think that's a message we're getting from Washington these days. So we'll see what happens. But for now, of course, there is very credible assistance. The money's been committed through most of this year. There is also Lend-Lease out there, which is not used, but it's some kind of a backup mechanism in case this administration, this town would find it problematic to continue getting other potential packages of assistance to Ukraine through Congress for some reason, and the reason. I still think actually that the people who are opposing assisting Ukraine in the Congress are in minority. So they might not be able necessarily to block completely the assistance to Ukraine next time there is a big vote in the Congress, in the House in particular, but that might change, So indeed, that you have Lend-Lease then, just in case. So for the time being, we're okay. For the time being, also this coalition is standing there. It's intact. The coalition of countries assisting Ukraine. But yeah, we need to think about the future, and also we need to think about the future in the sense of already potential rebuilding and recovery of Ukraine, where American assistance would be instrumental and critical as well. We should continue thinking about potential ways to secure Ukraine better in the longer term when this war is over, maybe one day. And that's actually emerging as a most in-demand theme for my talks at this time in the recent days. Like, what do you think going to happen when this war is over? Like, what can we do to actually address this issue and draw the right lesson from February 24th? How can Ukraine be better prepared with our assistance, for such an invasion in the future? Because I personally, and most of us in Ukraine, I think, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of all Ukrainians, but we understand that Russia will continue to be a threat to Ukraine. That the very existence of independent, viable, democratic, sovereign Ukrainian state next door is a problem to itself, in itself, by Russia, to Russia. So therefore, we need to think about it. And the role of US will be critical, whether it's maybe some continuing considerations and discussions about membership in NATO, or could it be some security guarantees? Then it's another thing. US would be really needed, of course, as a part of that security guarantees mechanism and framework if we are going that way. There've been some discussions about this last year, specifically within the Rasmussen Yermak Commission, other formats as well. But there's still no clarity, no understanding, like who's going to give those guarantees, what kind of guarantees, how binding and committing they would be. Because Ukrainians are expecting something similar to Article 5 of Washington Treaty, of NATO founding treaty, or maybe even more than that. Because even in Article 5, basically one member state is attacked, others would have to help, but they would consider how, some would send troops, others would send non-lethal military assistance, then yet others financial assistance and something like that. So what we need in case of Ukraine, if you think about the future, one says there's another aggression of Ukraine, Russia happens against Ukraine, it's immediate, it's a massive assistance to Ukraine to fight it back. And in the eyes of Ukrainians, maybe going as far as sending the troops to fight with Ukrainian troops against the Russians. And I don't think that's going to happen. And we need to talk about it. We need to be honest about it and fair, and should have a transparent, not transparent in the meaning that there should be public eye or journalists in the room, but transparent between the partners. Conversation like what would Ukraine want, need, expect from those guarantees, for it not to be the Budapest Memorandum number 2. because of course those assurances never worked, and it was very naive for a lot of people in Ukraine to think that Budapest Memorandum somehow safely guaranteeing our security. It was really naive. Most experts in the field, including myself, for years, if not decades, we were saying like, forget about it. The document was there in 1994. It did its role, maybe, at some point of time, but turn the page. We are basically at Russia's mercy. We are in this vacuum of security zone. That's how it is. Think about it. Okay, we can work and on getting assistance from other countries, but we are not part of this collective security arrangement. So yeah, we'll see. There will be a lot of discussions about the future, recovery and rebuilding, security guarantees, further financial assistance. I mean, people tend to forget that it's not just about weapons. I mean, in Ukraine, all our eyes are trained and focused on weapon supply because we have this war. So everyone is thinking like, okay, Phantoms, Abrams, other things, HIMARS, how many of them, where, so on, how soon, but it's also about financial assistance, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, helping to deal with the situation of our energy infrastructure that we now have in our country. In my hometown, my region, actually, somehow Odessa, it's the worst situation in Ukraine. So I'm hearing from people who are there, and it's pretty tough. It doesn't mean that Ukraine is on the verge of giving up. Of course not. On the contrary, if someone in Russia thought that maybe by sending those missiles and putting Ukraine into coldness and darkness and everything, they would, apparently that was, rumor has it that was a scenario. It would push Ukrainians into the streets demanding immediate ceasefire or peace treaty. Unbelievable, and that's another thing. I mean, that's not a subject of my conversation here today, but Russia never cared to find out and know enough, understand enough about Ukraine. Considering how much significance they attach to Ukraine, how Ukraine is critical to any Russia thinking about themselves and their great power project, their new imperialist power, it's unbelievable how they never gave themselves any attempt, even no try to understand it. If someone really came to Putin or someone and said, okay, let's destroy those electric power stations, and Ukrainians would be so, annoyed and struggling and suffering that they would actually go to the street and there'll be new Maidan and they would demand for Zelensky to sign some kind of peace treaty. That's unbelievable because, of course, something contrary happened, opposite happening. Ukraine is even more antagonized, even more angry about Russians and so on. So we'll see. I mean, there is a lot on the agenda. There is so much there, but of course, we only have as much limited time as we have for this conversation today. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to having questions and remarks from the audience here in person, but also people who are online. Thank you, Henry.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so I think we can go ahead and start opening up the discussion. I mean, maybe I'll just offer one initial question, which kind of comes out of what you've been saying. I mean, because on one hand, I mean, it strikes me that there's possible two different trends in U.S.-Ukrainian relations, right? That I discern from your talk. I mean, one is on one hand, as people have observed, there's been a kind of gradual ratcheting up of the kind of military assistance and the effectiveness, the kind of the quality of the defensive assistance that has been given to Ukraine over time, right?
Yes.
And so I wonder, what you see as kind of driving that that escalation. I mean, not of the conflict, but in terms of just the willingness to provide that. But on the other hand, there's a risk of fatigue, right, on the part of the government, right? And so and members of it.
You mean U.S. government?
U.S. Yeah. And so I wonder kind of how these two mesh,
right?
And what you see is kind of driving the process. What are the key factors we should be focusing on?
Great question. Well, in terms of escalation, I mean, what's driving it? That the war is ongoing. It's protracted. It's showing no signs of abating or subsiding. So that's what. And of course, if you think about Russia maybe preparing some major offensive, some people are triggered and alarmed by that, and we clearly saw it early in this year in the first weeks, and that's why you have a lot of enormous amount of activity even comparing to the last year, and people coming up with this tanks decision and other things. So there is this understanding that okay, we have this project, if you like, keeping Ukraine alive. Ukraine is doing very good jobs themselves, but they need continuous assistance from us. So we cannot abandon this project. So therefore, if there is any sign of maybe Russia maybe recapturing initiative in this war, which is becoming protracted, we need to do something about it. And the whole escalation, there can be a huge debate about, and it is on escalation, what it means and what do you do. For instance, last summer, this administration, the US administration, did not do any moves, any steps that they saw it that would maybe call for Russia to escalate. for instance, no HIMARS, no long-range missiles and other things. What did Putin do in return? Did he de-escalate? On the contrary, he doubled down. So he basically announced a referenda, quotation marks, annexation, quotation marks, and then proceeded with mobilization. So I think even from that one episode, and there'll be others, I think the logic is like, if you actually show weakness, the Putin would actually escalate. So, but if you don't show him weakness, then he might actually de-escalate or not being able to escalate. That's another question. Like, can Russia escalate even further? Because they've actually tried everything they have, except for weapons of mass destruction. But we've had this discussion in the recent months as well. Most experts believe that Russia wouldn't do it, for various reasons, including that they wouldn't be able to win the war, even if they use tactical nuke on Ukrainian troops on the battleground. It's not necessarily end the war. It's not necessarily something that Ukraine, like Japan, would be, in 1945, in August 1945, would say immediately, oh, okay, we are giving up, do what you want with us, because that's not going to be the situation. And I think in Russia, they understand it. And also, I think Americans and others conveyed to Putin that there will be some serious response, including maybe some military response, and that would be, God forbid, we go there. I mean, it's going to be a very, very dangerous moment. So, but in terms of expectations going forward, so the second trend was like,
well, just the risk of sort of fatigue.
Yeah, right.
Providing,
of course,
on one hand, providing, being willing to provide more and more of what Ukraine needs, but on the other hand, at the same time, some possible fatigue growing about,
we're not there yet. We're only kind of anticipating fatigue. I mean, it's another problem when you telegraph that there will be a fatigue. That's also maybe not very productive. Like almost publicly now, or it's not very tacit or secret or confidential. This administration is saying we're expecting fatigue, and that's probably wrong. Because first of all, you're kind of limiting yourself in what you can do. Second of all, you're giving a signal to those who are saying let's stop assisting Ukraine. They are also saying, okay, even the White House anticipates a slowdown and fatigue, and definitely sending wrong signal to Ukrainians, because like the Ukrainians like, oh, we are doomed. If at one point of time we wouldn't be getting any of those weapons, what can happen to this war? And most finally, it's a wrong signal to Putin too, because he's been preparing for this war of attrition, basically waging war of attrition, and trying to outweigh everyone and be patient, and basically saying, okay, just hang in there, the West will unravel, Ukraine would be on its own, we'll take it, so I think we shouldn't rush to this assumption that we're already seeing fatigue. You can still argue why Ukraine needs to be supported, why it should be a long-term project, why it is in American interest. I think it's very important too, because oftentimes in PR of this administration explaining why you support Ukraine, the focus is almost exclusively on values. Like, okay, it's outrageous what Russia is doing to Ukraine. That's why we're supporting Ukraine. I think if you're PR communication team of this administration, you should also double down and focus and put an emphasis on interests, how it is in American interest to continue to support Ukraine, how it would be terrible for American interests in the region and globally going forward decades if, God forbid, Russia prevails in that conflict. So therefore, I think there's much that can be done. And again, if we manage, hopefully, to have this advance, this offensive of Ukrainian troops anytime soon, and maybe liberating more land. Those episodes also, play really well, and they trigger and they enable more of optimism and less of fatigue. It happened with Kharkiv, happened with Kherson, happened with other places. Well, yeah, regionally, of course, when Russians retreated from Kyiv or Chernihiv early in the war, and people say, oh, it's not hopeless, it's not stalemate, it's not just trench warfare, it's not World War I, Western Front yet. So we can still actually enable Ukrainians to be successful in liberating more of their land. So there are so many unknowns and variables there. It's hard to see, but I think we're not there yet. And we should actively fight against this notion of fatigue, because it's not there, and announce it that it's coming soon would be wrong and premature.
Great, terrific.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and open up comments to the floor. And if you could just identify yourself, I don't know, can people here online?
Okay. From Switzerland.
Great.
So thank you so much for your talk. It's
Sure. Thank you for coming.
And particularly, I want to dig into this corruption thing to
Okay.
explain. It's really interesting because in Switzerland, far-right politicians use exactly the same argument. They compare it to a corrupt country and everything. So my question is more, how do maybe a little bit pushing, but how do Ukrainian oligarchs, because in Switzerland,
Yeah.
often they connect to the Ukrainian oligarchs and argue that it's corruption and those things. What is the role of Ukrainian oligarchs in addressing
Yeah.
this somehow
Sure.
fake news?
Fake news?
Not
Oh,
fake news, but somehow
Yeah.
to fight against
Okay.
the argument that
Yeah.
Ukraine is corrupt.
sure.
So,
So you're based here.
and obviously,
Okay.
yes, we can talk
So
about
I
it in
can
detail
only
later.
recommend you talking to the best expert on the oligarchy issue here, Alexander Fisun, who is my good friend and colleague from Ukraine. That's exactly his field. But as far as I myself here talking, I should say that, well, first of all, we're not seeing that much of assistance from Switzerland to start with. There's been some, but comparing to many other countries, don't get me wrong, there is much less. And we think that actually the country which is so affluent and well developed as Switzerland, might probably do more to assist Ukraine. Second of all, also don't get me wrong, but I think we can talk about the history of some corruption in Switzerland as well. Including maybe this practice of not doing anything about Russian assets there that are not frozen yet and not given to Ukraine yet. There've been some discussion just in the last few days, and it seems that the final decision being made, no, and the government is not going to take any of the Russian oligarchs' money that is placed in Switzerland and then give it to Ukraine. But then, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, yes, what's happening is de-oligarchization, and I'm doing better and better with actually being able to pronounce this word, yeah. And it's another thing, of course, and we had this discussion actually when Alexander had his presentation some time ago, some weeks ago at Harvard, that a lot of people now are alarmed by how Zelensky do it, because this country and the US and others were actually demanding for him to do something about oligarchs and their excessive influence in Ukraine's political and economic system for a long time. But now that he is applying some pressure on those oligarchs, they're beginning to ask questions like, is it legal? Is he within this legal framework? Is he using extra-legal methods? But the question then begets, like, can you actually do something about their excessive influence within Ukrainian political system if you only stay within this kind of legal framework, or you should actually use some of those levers and mechanisms that you see that Zelensky now has, some of them unprecedented because he's a wartime leader, because there is martial law. So of course, in terms of levers, in terms of like buttons that he can push, of privileges and prerogatives that he has much more than he had before, any other Ukrainian president had before. So he's applying some of that pressure. That's another question also, how selective that pressure, is he going after certain oligarchs and then letting others go and, roam freely and not addressing them, so, but actually it's been remarkable in terms of how much less influence oligarchs had since the start of the war. Not to mention that objectively speaking, their potential and resources have been diminished by the 8 years of the war before February last year, but also by this year, because they lost tons of their assets, financial assets. So if you speak about the biggest, most prominent Ukrainian oligarchs, they're much poorer now. They're still rich people, comparing to many of us other Ukrainians, but they're much poorer than they used to be. So which means there is much less money they can actually use to still buy influence within Ukrainian political system. But this situation is addressed. This issue is addressed. If you have corruption, it's not just about having oligarchs. Actually, unfortunately, corruption is widespread, so we need to address it in such a way, and we're trying to do it. But it's not easy, of course, because you have this war in our hands, and then on the other hand, you need to address corruption, and you feel like you need to at the same time, but it's not easy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Venko. I'm alumni, W alumni.
Okay.
I'm also a diplomat from Montenegro.
Okay.
I'm inactive.
All right.
So I'm, more liberal to speak up and to discuss
Okay.
certain issues with you. So I come from Montenegro, and we can draw many parallels
Okay.
between
Yeah.
Ukraine, Russia, Montenegro, and some of our neighbors and
Oh, yeah.
nations.
Okay.
And the way
Those we don't name.
you are perceived,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But it's and also about the issue of corruption and justification for any action because of corruption. Now
Yeah.
we can discuss from which side corruption comes, and
Yeah.
can it be
Right.
attached to nationalism, to different it's another question. But I want to focus on one thing that I want to ask you is, And it's when you discuss the ongoing war, and we know what's the experience of Russian invasion in Afghanistan in the late 70s and 80s, and how soon after that the Soviet Union broke down. And when you see this war that is ongoing in Ukraine, you have certain dynamics with oligarchs in Russia as well, and the way they are removed and the way they are actually taken care of by Putin. And we know that in all of our societies, they're more inclined toward personalities than toward systems. So when the person goes, the system is shaken. And I just wanted to see, how do you see Russia in this war in years to come? Or this is not a blitzkrieg, this is something that will last much longer. And fatigue might be present on all sides.
Yeah.
You know, the victims are less prone to fatigue because they have emotion. You know, unlike the others.
Yeah.
So I just want to see, how do you see this thing going on in the future? And when Putin is gone biologically, or however it happens, how do you see the chance for Russia itself? Because if Russia doesn't change their mindsets,
right,
as some of our neighbors as well, we will have the constant threat on the borders, however it plays out. So, you know, I was thinking Russia on one side, it's part of European culture, of European mindset, but also there's China there. Everyone else is looking their own opportunities from this war that is basically concentrated in Ukraine, and the Russian and Ukrainians are being killed.
Right.
So, I mean, I was maybe too broad, but I just wanted to see how they think about it.
Well, first of all, I think that you're right. There might be an exhaustion on the Russia side. You know, should I call it fatigue? Maybe not. But the problem is that Russia's stakes is higher, you know, in this war. They always needed Ukraine. They're very serious about Ukraine. So while in the West, you need to continue to explain all the time why we're supporting Ukraine. In Russia, you don't need to explain to anyone like why Ukraine matters, or Crimea matters for that matter. You know, so therefore it's very important, and it's there. You know, even if you remember that famous interview that Barack Obama gave to the Atlantic Monthly magazine shortly before leaving White House, that was unusual, called Obama Doctrine. He said there are red lines. Russia is much more invested in Ukraine. You know, invested meaning caring about Ukraine than we are. You know, they by definition can do more, you know, to keep Ukraine in their sphere of influence than what we can do from here to support Ukraine and keep Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence. So that's still true, you know. So I wouldn't say in the case of Russia, it's not fatigue, it's really maybe an exhaustion, or maybe just a lack of possibility to continue this war. It might come because sanctions are working after all, slowly, but they're actually biting in the Russian economy. They're running out of weapons. If they're not allowed to produce more new weapons, hopefully that's the case, then it's going to be a problem for them as well at some point of time. That's why already they're turning to countries like Iran and North Korea, but they don't have too many countries to turn to, of course, unlike Ukraine, which is now having this huge number of countries supplying weapons to Ukraine. So yeah, and in terms of financial resources, it's still there in Russia, as I mentioned. In terms of their public narrative about the war, well, whoever is against it, they probably already protested or left the country or whatever, or just keeping it to themselves. But what we're seeing is they're doubling down, and a lot of people are being mobilized. And a lot of people don't have problem with that, going and fighting in Ukraine against Ukraine. And Russia's not going to change quickly, of course. It might change, hopefully, one day, but not anytime soon. The Putinism is going to leave a lingering scar, you know, on Russian economy, political system, psyche, if you like. Ideology has been there a long time. You know, I often think these days, like the Nazi Germany was there for 12 years. Putin has been there for 20 plus years, you know, almost 25, I think, soon. So it's a lot of time, you know, it's a lot of time. Yeah. And that's why he really corroded the Russian soul. Whatever problems you had with Russian ideology and Russian collective psyche, even prior to Putin coming to power, you already had some problems. You already had some tensions with Ukraine, but that all multiplied really, and now coming on the surface, you know. So even when he's out of the picture, yes, there will be problematic relations. But I also don't believe in a scenario that if Putin is out of the picture, then the new guy would be even worse for Ukraine. I don't think so. I think it's really Putin's war. I think there's a lot of people in his inner circle who understand that this was probably a mistake. If he's out of the picture and not pulling strings anymore, they would probably not be willing or even able to continue successfully prosecute that war. Not to mention that if Putin is out of Russian political picture, there will be such a tremendous, instability and quarreling and bickering and infighting. Who would be the next? That would by itself already inhibit their ability to continue this systemic massive war against Ukraine. Thank you.
Alexander?
Thank you. Alexander Soon, visiting scholar here. European Russian Eurasian Studies. Thank you very much for your insightful talk.
Thank you so
much. My question is about difference of political attitudes within different political groups here in Washington DC and Washington Berkeley about Ukraine support. And I wonder to what extent strategic cooperation in Ukraine and the US and long-term military support depends on bipartisan consensus in Congress. And support of different political factions
Right.
within not only Republican but the Democratic.
Sure. Yeah.
So about this.
Yeah. Well, I touched on it a little bit in my presentation, but I can elaborate, of course. I'll be happy to. So, of course, it does depend on bipartisan consensus. It always did. One thing we had going for us always is that you had this bipartisan consensus. Even when, say, President Trump was in White House, there was still a certain group of government agencies that had the inertia of thinking and doing things in the field of foreign policy and national security, that they just basically continue doing their thing, despite what President Trump was saying and maybe doing. So another thing is, of course, the Republican Party has been changed, but it's not entirely still hijacked by Trump and his faction. So we haven't seen the final episode of like when we would know, is it something that, that the Republican Party is completely under their control. It might not be, it might be, we'll see the dynamics there in the coming 2 years before 2024. There've been, of course, a lot of backlash against Trump and weakening of Trump, specifically because of last year's midterm elections, which alarmed a lot of people in Ukraine. I can tell you, in the days coming up to midterm elections, I've been doing like up to a dozen interviews for Ukrainian media every day. And people wanted to know what's going to happen. And like, what if this Trump people, win? Does it mean that Ukraine's assistance will be cut like right away? No, of course not. I've tried to explain like how it works. The commitment, the money is there. There is Lend-Lease. So yeah, we're talking about maybe a group of people. How massive, we don't know. Would they grow or not? We don't know. I mean, they might pick up some votes and seats along the way. Last time there was a big vote on Ukraine's massive assistance was not a year ago, of course, but in the spring, basically, of last year, and you had 57 people in the House. So what is 57 out of like 450 or something? Well, it's not enough. It's not even, even if you look at the Republican Party, it's not that much. Right now, of course, the Matt Gaetz initiative, you have about 10 or 11 of them, I think, who are pushing it through the House. There are many people who are actually active participants of the Trump wing, but they're not necessarily part of that initiative. That's interesting too. So not even everyone in that particular wing is now necessarily on the same page with people who are pushing this initiative for not supporting Ukraine anymore. So I'm not saying we don't have reasons to worry. No, of course we do. It can change, and they can actually, in the logic of this politicizing of this issue, of the political struggle within the country, many more Republicans might actually join that wing. Because one of the things why they're critical of what US is doing, because they're critical of Biden. Since Biden says we need to support Ukraine, the logic of, between the relationship between the two parties, when he says politicized, when it's very emotional, it's very polarized. It's like, okay, we're going to oppose Biden because he says we're going to support Ukraine. So we'll see. We'll see. Will someone emerge as a viable candidate for 2024 in the Republican Party who might have a different position? You know, of course, we've heard Tim Scott and Nikki Haley already came out, but she's not going to be maybe a viable leading candidate. We'll see. We'll see. But for now, I don't see an immediate threat. We couldn't ignore it. We couldn't say it's going to be fine. We couldn't say necessarily we can be sure that the number of people who are going to continue supporting Ukraine in both parties are going to be a majority, a steady majority, you know. But for now, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. So we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we could squeeze in. Oh,
Maybe we should relax. I think it's depends on vision of Ukrainian victory.
Yeah.
And how it's looked like.
Right. Oh, yeah.
What is the
Oh, yeah.
defeat of Russia?
Yeah.
Is it a
Sure.
complete disintegration
Sure.
of Russian Federation?
Sure.
Or is it back to a status quo of
Right.
24th?
Sure.
Or it's back to
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
2014?
Yeah. It's going to be affected enormously by how the war proceeds. What's the end game there? You know, can we have the war ongoing or it ending a couple months from now? Who knows? What do you mean by end the war? Not even winning or losing, but what do you mean by end of the war? Are we going back to some kind of a low intensity conflict that we had 8 years before that? Or is going to be a pause? Is going to be actually an actual peace treaty or something? Unlikely. So yeah, of course, much of how people in this country and the Congress and elsewhere will perceive what needs to be done further would also depend, of course, on what happens on the battleground. Yeah.
okay, well, I'm afraid, unfortunately, we're out of time. I mean, this is a topic I think we could discuss for much more. But I think we'll have to wrap it up there. I apologize we didn't get to questions online this time, but Professor Dubovik.
Were there any questions there?
Yeah, there were a
Okay.
few. I mean, yeah.
Is there a way to direct people to me, those questions?
Yeah, sure.
After the talk? Okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, so yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully you'll be
Great.
giving other presentations around.
Sure,
So we'll continue
sure.
then. But
Thank you.
please
you.
join me for thanking Dr. Dubovik for really fast.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Okay. We can continue informally. if there
Sure,
are
of
other
course,
things.
yes.